everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, which is called The Use of the NCAST Parent-Child Interaction Scales in Healthy Babies, Healthy Children, and Nurse-Family Partnership Programs in Ontario, a Reintroduction. My name is Andrea Bodkin, and I am a Senior Program Specialist here at Public Health Ontario, and I'm very excited to be here today to learn something new for me and to get a refresh for so many of you. Before we start with today's session, I'd like to just begin by acknowledging the land on which each of us are sitting, living, working, playing, and loving. I want to acknowledge that this land, Turtle Island, now known as Canada, has been home to Indigenous people for thousands of years. And after decades and centuries of colonization and restrictive policies, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are still here on Turtle Island. There are thriving communities all over this land. There are communities who are taking back control of their communities, their child welfare services, their education services, their policing services. And as a commitment to reconciliation, I invite each of you to consider the history of the land that you are on today. What nations lived on your land before you arrived? Where are those nations now? And how can you support reconciliation through your work and through your own personal life? So I'm now going to just mention a few housekeeping items. We do have the chat pod enabled for today's sessions, and we encourage you to chat throughout to everyone to share links, to ask questions, etc. We're going to address those questions at the end of the presentation, so I'll be wildly keeping track of all of your great inquiries, and then our speakers will have a chance to answer your question at the end of the session. And if at any point you're experiencing any technical issues, please email capacitybuilding@aohpp.ca. So now I'm going to present my co-moderator for the day, Dr. Susan Jack. Dr. Jack is a professor at the McMaster School of Nursing and lead for the Public Health Nursing Practice Research and Education Program. You know Susan, you love her. Here she is.
Great, thank you so much, Andrea. And I'm really thrilled to be here today on this last week of summer, a beautiful day, to co-moderate with Andrea and to represent the work of PHN Prep. And our goal is to continue to support public health nurses and all staff in the HBHC and NFP programs to deliver your supports and services to the families that you serve in your communities. So today's webinar is going to introduce the NCAST Parent-Child Interaction Scales in the context of Ontario Public Health Units. And we're going to hear a brief review of the history of the program, the roles and benefits of these assessment tools within HBHC and Nurse-Family Partnership programs. And because I want to maximize the amount of time that Anya has to talk about these scales with you, it's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's presentation, who is Anya Cahill, who is a public health nurse at KFLNA in Kingston. And Anya is the Ontario Parent-Child Relationship Program Nursing Practice Lead. I know that's a mouthful, but in this role, Anya provides professional nursing practice supports to the NCAST Parent-Child Interaction Instructors across Ontario's 34 public health units through collaboration with partners from PHN Prep, the Ontario Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, and the Parent-Child Relationship Program at the Barnard Center, which is at the University of Washington in the United States. So I'm going to stop here. Welcome, Anya, and over to you, Anya.
Thank you, Susan. That was such a wonderful introduction. I need not say any more. I wanted to talk about, well, what we're going to do today. We're going to ask ourselves a series of questions as we learn about the use of these NCAST Parent-Child Interaction Scales in the Ontario's publicly funded home visiting programs. So we're going to ask questions like, what are the NCAST Parent-Child Interaction Scales? We also call these PCI scales, so you'll hear me say that throughout. We want to know, where did they come from? What is their history? Why and how are they used in the Ontario home visiting programs? We want to know about the current functionality of these scales, the roles and the benefits of their use. We also want to know what the role is of the NCAST PCI Instructor in Ontario, and where you would find out more about recruitment criteria, role expectations, and supports provided. And finally, if we have time today, we're going to end with a little overview on what the scales aren't. Sometimes there's misconceptions on how many things we can do with these scales. They're amazing, but they can't do everything. So we do want to take a look at what the scales don't measure. It's already been mentioned, but please do fill the chat full of questions. We'll have time at the end. And if you have agencies or individual specific questions, don't hesitate to email me. My email address will come up at the end again as well. So let's get started with some inspiration from child psychologist Dr. Bruce Perry. In his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, he offers us this quote, and I think it's really relevant for our talk this morning. He says, "The more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be able to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love." So with this thought of the importance of relationships in mind, let's ask ourselves the first question. What are the NCAST PCI scales? Well, friends, they are valid and reliable assessments that measure parent-child interactions. They are backed by an extensive body of research across all sorts of disciplines and are used in 13 countries worldwide. Ultimately, the NCAST PCI scales look at defined behaviors of the caregiver and the child. They do this through two opportunities, and they're the opportunities we use in home visits. The first is through a feeding interaction. This offers us the chance to observe 76 items that can be used with children from birth to 12 months of age. The second opportunity is through a teaching interaction. There's 73 items here, and they can be used with children up to 36 months of developmental age. Each option then provides the home visiting public health nurse more than 70 opportunities to see what's going well in the relationship between the child and the caregiver. For even more detailed information about the real specifics of these assessments, we do have a resource document. It's the PHN Prep Professional Resource, Parent-Child Relationships Program, Parent-Child Interaction Scales, and Overview. There will be a link posted at the end of the webinar to be able to access this resource, as well as the slides. So curious then, where did these come from? How did they end up in Ontario? The short answer is the scales come from the Parent-Child Relationships Program at the Barnard Center, which, as Susan mentioned, is housed at the University of Washington in Seattle. I may sometimes refer to the Parent-Child Relationships programs as PCRP during this webinar. The longer answer is that they come from the work of Dr. Catherine Barnard. In the early 1970s, the United States Public Health Service contracted Dr. Barnard and her team to study the ways of measuring health and caregiving environments of infant and young children as part of the Lyndon B. Johnson War on Poverty. Her goal then was to determine predictors that could identify as early as possible children who are at risk for later developmental problems. The outcomes of her work found that any screening or assessment plan must look beyond the child and into the transactions between the child and the environment, both as social and physical. Thus, the birth of the Child Health Assessment Model. So in 1978, Dr. Barnard published this model, and it encompasses these three spheres that overlap. First, at the bottom is the child. This is where the individual child's self-regulation, temperament, their physical appearance, their sleeping patterns, eating patterns, that type of information is held. It overlaps with the caregiver, which includes individual information on the caregiver, like their physical health, their mental health, their ability to cope, their education level. And the final circle of environment, social and financial resources, housing, food security, items like that. The most important thing Dr. Barnard issued in this model is the interaction between the three, where the child, the caregiver, and the environment all meet. She made an assumption that a child's first lessons about the world are communicated in seemingly casual day-to-day interactions like feeding and reading and teaching and bathing and diaper changing and games and singing. Through this, she concluded that the parent-child interaction would be the potent predictor of subsequent development. With this in mind, she published the Barnard Model. It's the core value of her work to show that infant development is dependent upon parent or caregiver responding to signals from the child in a loving and dependable manner, starting from the moment of birth. In this model, the caregiver and the child each have responsibilities within the relationship. And these relationships or responsibilities are the subscales that are assessed throughout the PCI scales. So this model truly becomes the basis of this assessment tool. The parent has responsibilities like responding sensitively to the child's cues, responding and attempting to alleviate the child's distress, and providing opportunities that offer growth, cognitive growth, and social emotional growth. The infant or the child has responsibilities as well. They need to be able to respond to the caregiver as well as provide clear cues. So these responsibilities are what can be observed through cues, gestures, other actions, and words. This becomes the basis for those 70+ items on the teaching and feeding scales, respectively. Kind of a big deal, so it takes a bit of work to understand how to use them. Certification is required to become confirmed as reliable in the use of these assessment tools. This means that if multiple nurses observe the same interaction, the scoring on the assessment tool would be the same between the observers at least 85% of the time over the 70+ items. We offer certification courses locally at each public health unit. They're run through the local unit's NCAST PCI Instructor. And the results of the certification courses are sent to PCRP in Seattle for grading. Nurses new to HBHC or NFP should be certified in the use of the PCI scales as soon as is possible in their orientation. It takes 3 days to learn and certify in each scale. So between the two, that's a total time investment of 40 hours per nurse. The scale training, the certification courses, should be completed in 3 consecutive day blocks, 1 scale at a time, with at least a month in between wherever possible. Certification courses can be completed virtually, in person, or a mix of the two. It just depends on the instructor. To become certified, nurses have to first complete the Keys to Caregiving series. Home visiting is an asset, but it's not a requirement. In the certification course, each nurse requires a new manual relevant to the course being instructed. So a feeding manual for the feeding course or a teaching manual for the teaching course. Any version can be used as long as it's new. The manuals must include both a practice disagreement form and a reliability form. PCRP will not accept photocopies. The nurse will also require the appropriate scoring pad for the scale being instructed. You can use the light blue or the dark blue for the teaching scale, and you can use the light pink or the dark or the green for the feeding scale. There's been some updates, but they still can be used. If participating in a certification course virtually, the nurse will also require reliable internet connection, access to whatever video conferencing platform is being used, and a computer or laptop with a camera and audio, headphones or speakers. The training is very interactive, and participating nurses need to be able to see and hear in order to participate. The instructor will send the completed reliability forms off to PCRP and receive results back in about a week. Once confirmed reliable, nurses can begin to use the scales in their practice immediately. And the cost of the manuals and the scoring pads, as well as the teaching administration kits, is the responsibility of each local public health unit. You may have heard that reliability and coding of the scales can wane over time. So all healthy babies, healthy children, nurses and nurse-family partnership nurses are required to renew their reliability annually through a process of recertification. Recertification is also completed locally by the public health unit's NCAST PCI Instructor. It takes at least 1 day, but best practice includes a preparation day to review key concepts prior to attempting reliability. Each calendar year, 1 scale is recertified. So from January to December of 2022, the focus was on recertifying in the teaching scale. And beginning in January 2023, we'll shift the focus to recertifying on the feeding scale. Again, these can be completed in person, virtually, or a combination of the two, depending on the instructor. And reliability recertification results are received from PCRP about a week after submitting them. Once again, nurses will require their manuals, the ones they used in their initial certification course, and a stack of the appropriate scoring pads. If they're completing the course virtually, they'll need robust internet and appropriate technology to access all of the video and audio components. The cost for annual recertification for HBHC and NFP nurses is paid for by the Ministry of Children, Community, and Social Services. There's no cost for this to the local public health agency. So we've had lots of questions about nurses returning from redeployments. And I can let you know, for nurses returning to their home health unit or back to home visiting after pandemic response redeployment, we did put together a bit of a professional practice resource called the Public Health Nurse Certification and Recertification in the NCAST Parent-Child Interaction Scales of 2022. So it's very timely and relevant to the situation at hand right now. Specifically, on the second page is guidance to facilitate certification and recertification of HBHC and NFP public health nurses in 2022-2023. So please do check this guideline for some guidance on what to do about nurses who haven't certified in the last couple of years. And of course, reach out to me directly. Every case is individual, and we want to make sure we're meeting everyone's needs. Another question that comes up is about those teaching kits. So these are the teaching administration kits. They include the materials that are specific to the implementation of the PCI teaching assessment. Not every task in the teaching assessment requires task materials, but where materials are required, like blocks or a puzzle, rattles, these are the materials that are to be used. So it's important to know that teaching kits are not required as part of the certification course. Your manual and your scoring pad will be enough to certify you. Teaching kits can also be shared amongst the team. However, best practice shows us that the nurses are more likely to complete PCI teaching assessments more frequently if they have access to their own teaching kit. Teaching kits can be handed down. So as a nurse leaves the program, they should leave their kit behind, and it can be resumed by another nurse. As well, the contents of the kits should be reviewed at least annually to make sure that nothing is broken or has become missing. Finally, materials in the kits cannot be substituted. The fidelity of the scales is dependent upon the use of these particular materials. Some materials like crayons, safety scissors, the plain white paper, even the Helen Oxbury board books, they can be replaced with similar items that you could purchase locally. But the remaining materials need to be reordered through PCRP if replacements are required. These are the tools that the scale was validated against, so we need to honor that. Replacement materials and additional kits are the financial responsibility of each local public health unit. So with some of the nitty-gritty behind us, let's talk a bit about how we actually use these things in Ontario's home visiting programs. It is through the use of these scales that PHNs can directly observe the ways in which caregivers are sensitive to their children's cues, how they respond to their children's distress, how they provide social, emotional, and cognitive growth fostering opportunities. Not if they do, or how many things they don't do, but how many things in that given interaction the caregiver does do. In addition to observing the caregiver's strengths in interacting with the child, the nurse can also observe for the cues the child gives the caregiver and how the child responds to the caregiver's attempts to interact. By identifying all the ways the dyad is interacting, the nurse can share strengths back with the family and develop an individualized, appropriate care plan for that family. This care plan will be based on the family's strengths and areas for growth, as identified through comparison with data tables provided by the Parent-Child Relationship Center. Although the PCI scales were developed and tested with samples of families in the United States, evidence has been established to confirm that the NCAST database can be used reliably for assessing parent-child interactions in normative and high-risk Canadian families. So how do we use these? Well, we use them in home, in person. They can also be completed virtually through secure video conferencing platforms. They can be completed with each caregiver enrolled in service and for any eligible child in the family service. So this would include children from birth until 36 months of developmental age. The HBHC guidance document, last published in 2012, indicates that the scales should be used within the first 2 visits after the in-depth assessment is completed. Should be used in line with developmental milestones, and we'll take a look at those in just a second. They should be used prior to an update of the family service plan as needed. They should be used in conjunction with complementary specialized programming delivered to the program families, things like interactional guidance, as well as our partner in parenting education program. And finally, the scales should be used when preparing a family for transition or discharge from service. Think about the PCI scales in Healthy Babies, Healthy Children and Nurse-Family Partnership, akin to taking vital signs in an ER admission. Home visiting staff need a baseline of where a dyad is at to begin to understand the ways in which they may benefit from our program's support. And like vital signs on hospital admission, the PCI scales must be repeated. The mantra of PCRP is multiple measures over multiple time points, using each scale as applicable repeatedly over time. We'll take a Dr. Bruce Perry break here and review another quote from The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. The fact that the brain develops sequentially and also so rapidly in the first years of life explains why extremely young children are at such great risk of suffering lasting effects of trauma. Their brains are still developing. The same miraculous plasticity that allows young brains to quickly learn love and language, unfortunately, also makes them highly susceptible to negative experiences as well. So we have to get this right and provide the right parenting support right from the start. When should we do these scales then? Right away. This slide is actually taken from a presentation from the managers and directors meeting for Healthy Babies, Healthy Children in May of 2016, but the information is still 100% accurate. Both the feeding and teaching scales can be completed at any time, and they would be appropriate to be used at these particular key intervals. So if you're not sure when to use one, try one of these times, when the child is 2 weeks old, 3 months old, 8 months old, and 12 months old. The teaching scale has a longer reach through the first, second, and third year of life until the child reaches 36 months of developmental age. So recall, multiple measures over multiple time points. Again, from Dr. Perry, one of the few things I knew for sure by then about traumatized children was that they need predictability, routine, a sense of control, and stable relationships with supportive people. Regular use of the PCI scales in our HBHC and NFP practice will give concrete areas to guide intervention. They will transform the nurse's view of the parent-child relationship and give the nurse a new lens with which to see the strengths and opportunities for growth in the parent-child relationship. In our work, it can often feel like there's more pressing issues to address than assessing the parent-child relationship. Our families often experience things like housing insecurity, nutritional scarcity, intimate partner violence, court dates, unemployment, low educational attainment, the list goes on. What we need to remember, front and center, and if you take anything from today's webinar, it's that parents must still parent through all the crises. Our role should be in connecting families with supports in their community wherever possible to aid in crisis resolution that is outside of our scope. This will allow the staff of HBHC and NFP to focus on parental wellness, healthy child development, and the development of positive parenting practices, because the parenting of our families is what will protect their children from developing negative responses and outcomes to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Having a supportive, present, and consistent adult in their children's lives will help prevent their children from experiencing negative long-term effects of these crises. To do this, we use the PCI scales to assess the parenting strengths and build targeted, individualized care plans to support those strengths and fill in any gaps to help the parent improve in their competence and confidence in parenting, thus minimizing the effects of the ACEs on their children. Having a targeted, individualized care plan ensures the work the nurse is doing is the right work. Without informing the care plan by way of PCI assessment, the efforts of the nurse will not be as effective or as efficient. And as Dr. Perry says, the research on the most effective treatments to help child trauma victims might be accurately summed up in this way. What works best is anything that increases the quality and number of relationship in the child's life. So to ensure these assessments are standardized in public health units across Ontario, the provincial government has trained our own NCAST PCI instructors. The NCAST PCI instructors used to be called the master trainers. It's a leadership role available within each HBHC or NFP program in Ontario. The NCAST PCI instructor is a PHN with additional training and instructor level certification to facilitate certification courses for new PHNs on how to use the scales, as well as to annually recertify current NCAST PCI scale users. The NCAST PCI instructor is also responsible for maintaining and reporting local statistics for certification and recertification, providing practice guidance to HBHC and NFP team members, and maintaining and enhancing their own professional practice knowledge with respect to the use of and administration of the PCRP resources, including the scales. So to accomplish this, the NCAST PCI instructors are guided by the Ontario Parent-Child Relationship Program's Nursing Practice Lead, and they mutually support each other through the community of practice. The entire community of practice meets monthly by video conference and informally through the Mac Health virtual community of practice platform. I'm available by phone, email, Microsoft Teams, between video conferencing for one-on-one support. And for even more detailed information about the role of the instructor, please do check out the NCAST Parent-Child Interaction Scales, roles and responsibilities of the instructor. So we have 44 NCAST PCI instructors and trained across the province. So they represent 31 of the 34 public health units across all 7 regions. There's 3 health units at present that do not have an instructor. So we will have a call for instructor candidates coming out in early September of 2022 in anticipation of a virtual training for 2 weeks in January of 2023. For more information, check out that previously mentioned resource, which will cover all of the requirements for the NCAST instructor. This includes things like having a baccalaureate degree in nursing, being an employee of an Ontario public health unit, actively managing a caseload in HBHC or NFP, having completed the Keys to Caregiving course, and successfully completed the NCAST instructor workshop, which is run through the Parent-Child Relationships program. And finally, there is a written case study that each instructor completes at the end of their training. So the last thing I want to touch on today before we jump into our questions is what the scales are not. They are a lot of wonderful things. But what they are not is an option for telephone visits. Scales must be completed in person or virtually through video conference. They can't be done over the phone. They are not only for English or French-speaking clients. The scales can be done with the use of an interpreter, either in-person interpretation or through a phone service. They're not only for maternal assessment. They can and should be completed with fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, whoever the parent identifies as the child's caregiver. Only for biological they are not only for biological families. They can be and should be completed with adoptive families and children in kinship or fostering placements. They are not a one-time use checklist. These assessments are to be used repeatedly throughout the family service. Unfortunately, they're not available for children older than 36 months of developmental age. So you need to use them right at the start. And finally, they are not to be completed by individuals who have not been found reliable in the use of their scales. The certification component is mandatory. And more broadly, sometimes these PCI scales get a little bit mixed up, but I just want to clarify, they are not an assessment of attachment, and they are not the same as the parent capacity assessment. They may inform one, but they are not one. Again, what they are is a valid assessment of the parent-child relationship. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your time, and I'm very interested to open the floor to questions. So Dr. Jack, if you don't mind pulling the questions from the chat, and we can post the link to both the slides and the reference documents that I mentioned in today's webinar.
Great. Thank you, Anya. That was incredible. Such a lovely overview of the scales and some key tips for what they are, when they should be used, and what they're not. And speaking of when they should be used, we've had one request if you could just pop back to the when they can be used slide.
100%. So there's two slides on when they can be used. The first is for both the feeding and teaching. Here we go. The first one is both. So both the feeding and the teaching. Now they can be used at any point, right? So right from birth, the feeding scale can be used until the child is 12 months of developmental age. And these were some recommendations that came at good times to complete those assessments. And this is based on child's age. So 2 weeks of the child's age, 3 months of the child's age, again at 8 months, and finally at 12 months, which is the last opportunity to use it. At KFLNA, we really strive to, with the feeding scale, make sure that we get one that's done at breast or bottle, and another feeding scale that's done with solid foods, because so much can change in those two interactions. This is the teaching scale. So the feeding scale has aged out at 12 months, but you can continue to use the feeding scale right up until 36 months of developmental age. The change in the child slows down a little bit, but is still very rapid. So 3 suggested timelines are offered: 18 months, 24, and 36. But again, you can be doing them as much as you want and repeating them with multiple caregivers. So if there's more than one caregiver in the home, go ahead and do a scale with one, and another day do a scale with another, because the child is being parented by more than one person.
Sonia.
Mm-hmm.
And these are great tips. I'm thinking we're going to have to listen to this recording and do another FAQ on important tips. So the next question asks about, is it okay to complete the PCI scales with the father as well? And this nurse has found that many dads are home and providing the care as well as with mom, and that she's noticed that when completing the scale analysis, they all say maternal education, but there's an assumption that it's okay to change the language to say parent education, or is there a preference for mom only to complete the assessments with?
An excellent question. And it comes back to these scales being grounded in the 1970s. So because they're validated, reliable tools, changes in the language like that haven't been made, but we can convert maternal into caregiver. So as a nurse in the home, absolutely be doing these scales on the father. Like I mentioned, the grandparents, whoever the primary caregiver and secondary caregiver are identified on your family, you should be doing those scales. So when you look at the data tables in the manual and it says maternal education attained, just use the education attained for whichever caregiver that was. So don't use mom's university completed education when you're scoring dad, and don't use dads when you're scoring moms. So if you've gone and you've watched the mom, ask what her educational attainment is, and then use the data tables that reference that for her. Same, if you're going to go and you do dad, ask what their educational attainment is and use that data for making your comparisons. And it's not always the same, right? But yeah, some of the language there is still very maternal focused on moms, but it absolutely can be used on dads. And like I mentioned, kin placements, foster placements, whoever the caregiver is in that family.
Now this next question, and I think your response is going to be of interest to nurses, managers, supervisors, and any other administrators, because I think underlying this next question is the concept of the invisible work of public health nurses. When we look at how public health nurses spend time in home visiting programs, very often implementing organizations or health units don't account for the invisible or hidden work of nurses. You know, no one ever asks you, how much time do you take to locate a client? This is all invisible work. And in doing the NCAST scales, there's some invisible work around the amount of time related to both doing the scales, but the documentation. So here's the question. Is there a recommendation, or do you have guidance on how long each scale should take a PHN to complete? For example, a 1-hour home visit to complete the scale, and then 2 hours of documentation assessing the data. Because the challenge right now is that many nurses on teams are experiencing workload issues, and this creates challenges for completing NCAST based on the time that is allowed from management. So, you know, in your experience of doing this, what is your guidance? What do you think is the reality of how long this work takes, so that there's some reasonable expectations within the team and management?
That's an excellent question. In my experience, any longer in a family's home than an hour is too much. You've lost them, or whatever the focus and the point of your visit was has gotten washed into a myriad of other things. So in the home, if a PCI scale is on your plan for that day, and even better if it's not, but the caregiver's like, oh, I think the baby's hungry, that's your cue to say, oh, can I just do this thing, and hop in on that. If you, same thing with suddenly the baby is in a great mood and they're smiling and playing, and you think this is the time I want to see this caregiver teach the baby something, hop on that. Feeding assessments in the home, PCI assessments in the home, can take a long time because you're watching an entire feed. So it's from the moment that the caregiver is saying, I think the baby wants to eat, until they say to you, I think the baby's done. Sometimes, you know, a solid feed, that could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Sometimes a breastfeed, that could be 25 minutes. And you're watching and you're observing and assessing and essentially not talking that whole time. So that's potentially a visit in itself. If you have multiple caregivers and you want to try an opportunity with both, it's not going to work with feeding because the baby's going to be satiated, but you might have an opportunity with teaching, if the baby is still in a good mood, to be able to do 2 teaching assessments in one day if you had multiple caregivers. Teaching assessments, the act of teaching shouldn't be more than 5 minutes. It's quick. Sometimes it's a little bit longer, maybe 10 minutes, because the child is interested and wants to keep doing whatever the task is, and that's great.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anya. There's a question around the need to adjust the time points for prematurity. So if you could maybe provide some context around that question, and then a response around what would be recommendations for public health nurses on adjusting time points.
Sure. It's easy because we actually don't. We go off of chronological age. So you can enter onto your screen and again into ISCIS the exact age, chronological age of the child that's being assessed. Where it becomes a little bit more wishy is how long can you use the feeding scale? So my baby was 8 weeks early. Can I use it until they're 14 months chronological age? Yes, because they are still developmentally 12 months of age, but you don't need to do any adjustment to do that. You can still enter in their chronological age. Now, as children get through the teaching scale and they're coming out to 36 months of age, generally we've stopped adjusting ages for prematurity at the 24-month mark. So we wouldn't be doing that in that 3rd year of life heading into 36 months. But you may have a little one with an identified global delay or some other issues going on that has them not quite 36 months developmentally for a few more months. And that's okay. You can still use their chronological age on the scale and in ISCIS. You'll just reference the data table for the developmental age that you feel they most accurately reflect. But now we're not talking about a 25-minute breastfeeding with burping in between and all of these beautiful things. We're just talking about a short window. So you should be able to fit a teaching in to a 1 hour long or less home visit without much problem. The what if factor is the mood of the baby. So you need a few minutes to prepare, because you've always got to make sure you've got the right manuals with you, at least one scoring pad, some note paper, your materials if you need them. So there's a bit of preparation that comes in advance of this, which is going alongside with the rest of the preparation you're doing for your visit that day. In the home, you're looking at as little as 5 minutes to say, oh, you think your baby is hungry, to maybe closer to 25 minutes, half an hour. You should be scoring your scale in the home. So the time for checking, yes, they did this, no, I didn't see it, happens within the home visit. You ask the family for permission to have a few minutes of time to yourself to take out your manual and do the scoring in the home. So you've got your numbers done there. It also, and most importantly, gives you the opportunity to provide immediate positive feedback. Okay, so you've been through everything and you can see, oh yeah, I remember it was great when the baby did this and you responded in this way. Well done, mama. That's great. Well done, papa. I saw when you did this. So the scoring part should be done in the home so that you can give your positive feedback. At the conclusion of your visit and you get back to the office, there is more work to be done, absolutely. So you've got a final score, you've got subscale scores on everything. Now you need to reference that back to the data tables. And there's a number of different ways to do this, which all become faster over time. So if you're new and it seems like it takes forever, it does. And if you've been around for a while, it gets faster. So you will be pulling from the right table. We have some pre-created bell curves. That's what I find is the most efficient way to recognize if a family is within a normative statistical area, or if they're on either side of an excellent strength and we really want to praise this, versus something a little bit more left tail that's giving us some work to be done. So we've got a couple of options, and the NCAST PCI instructors, in addition to their community of practice, we also have a subset working group. And they're an amazing machine of efficiencies and publications. And they're going to be working on sharing a resource that actually comes from Durham Public Health. It's got some great information about doing this statistical stuff, as well as some other promos and tips on how to do this and make it easier. So that will be coming down the pipe. So hold on and be excited for that. But yeah, you have to come back to the office. You need to look at each subscale. You need to reference the data tables and come up with where are your gaps and your strengths. Then you need to figure out what are those strengths, where are the areas that we're going to focus on, and what are our tools to do that? Is it further screening? Is it other assessments? Is it referrals? Is it bringing in a family home visitor if your health unit uses one? Is it pulling something from PIPE? Is it baby cues, keys to caregiving, or another set of materials that you use, or a community program we can refer to? So the question was time. At least a half an hour if you're new, for sure. You start to see similar patterns over time and you feel a bit more like, okay, I know where to do this. I know what worked in another family, perhaps I know where to at least start to try. Don't forget you need to update it all into ISCIS if you're using ISCIS as your documentation platform. So recording the scale in there for sure, entering it into data that way. And then if you're using ISCIS for its service plan or whatever your documentation tool is, you'll need to be updating, perhaps identifying a new goal, or adding updated strategies and interventions to goals that you already have existing based on the outcome of your assessment, and then creating your plan for your next home visit. So yeah, it's work intensive, but so meaningful, because now your work is targeted and directive based on reliable and valid material. So it's not just you thinking, I think they would benefit from this. It's you going, I know that this will help them.
Great, thank you, Anya. You know, and it's a reminder too that these aren't just forms that need to be completed because they're information to be added to ISCIS, that there's real purpose and value to these assessments that inform a plan and an intervention, and a recognition you know, that everyone is aware of, that that documentation takes a substantive amount of nursing time. Now we just have time for, and if we don't get through all the questions, we are copying them. So we will post answers in the community of practice, the PHN prep community of practice, as well as the NCAST community of practice. But some quick, your two top quick tips for best practices and using the NCAST scales with interpreters.
Yes. PCRP has some information shared on how to do this and do it as best as you can. My biggest suggestion is to have dialogue with the interpreter beforehand, if at all possible. If there's a way to know who is coming from an agency or who that interpreter is going to be able to have even a 3-minute conversation to say, this is what I need to know. It is very important that you tell me the words that they say as closely as you can. So if they say the red ball, I need to know they said the red ball, and don't just tell me they said the ball. Because the scale is so finite in its details that letting the interpreter know ahead of time that you're not looking for an overviewed summary, but you're looking for as much as possible a word for word translation is going to be a real asset for you. Have that conversation too about what's going to work best for this new team. Do you want them to live tell you everything that is being said as the assessment is ongoing? Or do you want them to record it and you're watching and then they tell you afterward? That's going to be personal preference. Some nurses prefer to hear the interpreter speaking as they view the interaction so that they feel like they're getting the words at the same time. Some would rather just hone in on the real body language and the physical components, gestures and cues that are happening, and then hear the words later. So that's a discussion to have so that you can sort that out the best. With an interpreter on the phone, it can be a little bit different because they're not seeing the same thing that's happening in the home as if they were live with you. But again, it's worth having that conversation to start. That's my biggest tip. And then, of course, look on the community of practice because there's a whole document from PCRP on how to successfully use interpreters in these scales.
Great. Thanks, Sonia.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is how do you sell this to parents? Do you have a script or a tip of how you introduce the assessment to a parent so that it's well received?
Right. Very similar to that of using an interpreter. Tell the family right from the start. So we have somewhat of an opportunity when we're doing the in-depth assessment, we're learning everything about them. We've made that decision on if the program will be a good support for them or not. That's the time to say, here's what our program is. You can expect this many visits, this frequency of visits. Here's what I'm going to come and do. Sometimes I'm going to come and we're going to do these little tools where you'll teach your baby something and I'm just going to watch. Sometimes when I come and your baby wants to eat, I'm just going to watch you feed. And it's part of how I learn about your family, how I learn how your baby communicates with you. It usually goes okay when they've had a bit of a heads up, because at that time, if they don't want any part of that, then they can say, I don't think this program is for me, or maybe it's not for me right now and I'll come back to it another time. And that has to be okay. But then they know this is the thing that we do when the nurse comes over. Sometimes we play games. Sometimes we watch videos. Sometimes we go outside for a walk. Sometimes I'm going to watch you feed your baby. And it will become okay. And they can ask questions then. Then you've preempted yourself. So when you're thinking, okay, next visit, we're going to do one of these scales. At the end of the visit, you can say, when we're picking the time, let's think about when Jimmy is going to be hungriest. Because I'd really like to do that one where I watch you feed Jimmy. And then you can coordinate. Well, Jimmy usually eats around whatever and try to come for that time. Then you get good buy-in. Same thing with teaching. I think we're going to do a teaching scale next time. What do you think is Jimmy's best time of the day? When is he most likely to want to play with you? And then you can schedule your visit to come at that time. Then the caregiver knows, right? Well, we're going to do this next time. And you can remind them when you're calling to confirm the visit, confirming everyone as well. And you can remind them, don't forget, when I come today, I'm really looking forward to watching you play with Jimmy. And they're usually good. Be honest when they ask questions. And it's okay to remind people that this is a health assessment tool. It's confidential information. So sometimes families are worried about these reports coming back to protective agencies or their primary caregiver, but you can't share that information without their consent unless there's risk involved, right? So you can remind them, this is confidential information. It's just for you and me. It's to help me plan your care and service.
Great, excellent. And Anya, you just did a beautiful job too of summarizing key trauma and violence informed care principles. Provide clear expectations, provide anticipatory guidance, and create emotionally safe environment of care by assuring confidentiality. Okay, we have like 30 seconds for the last question before we close up here. Can you provide clarification where on one of your slides, it had said that NCAST assessments are not an assessment of attachment, especially if NCAST assessments help inform our nurse interventions to help support attachment between parents and caregivers?
Yeah, assessing attachment is a whole like clinical psychology, psychiatry thing that's not within the scope of at least home visiting nursing in Ontario. What our tools do is they really look at assessing the relationship, right? Those key components. Is the caregiver responding sensitively? Are they trying to alleviate distress? Do they offer opportunities that promote growth? While looking to see if the child gives cues and responds to cues. That's a very finite, tactile, on a specific interaction at a specific time. Not enough to say about attachment. It's not a strange situation. It doesn't come with all of the other types of mental health assessments that would go into an overall attachment assessment. So, but I can see why people sometimes are like, oh, well, is their attachment good because you've done this? I can tell you if their relationship is doing well or seems appropriate at that age and stage, but I can't tell you about the type of attachment that dyad has based on these indicators.
Great, thank you, Anya. It's always amazing to me how quickly an hour goes up. So as we wrap up today, I'd really like to thank Anya. Thank you for presenting. Andrea, thank you for co-hosting. Thank you to Public Health Ontario for their incredible support. And I would like to thank everyone from the HBHC and NFP teams who took an hour from your very busy days today to join us. So thank you to all of you. Please know that you can expect to receive a brief and anonymous survey for today's session. And if you can please try to complete this helps us improve our programming as well as to identify what webinars PHN Prep can facilitate to meet the practice and education needs of public health nurses who do home visiting. And so the link is in the chat for today's evaluation session. In the chat, you will have also found the link earlier to this slide deck, to the resources that Anya mentioned, and the recording will be posted in a couple of weeks. And then just as a little plug, our next PHN Prep webinar will be September 28th at 9:30, and it's going to be on supporting complex families, improving outcomes for infants and children, an overview of the Parents Under Pressure program. So registration links will be available in the next few weeks. So stay tuned. We'll make sure to send all that information out to all of the teams. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.